They say a house built on sand won't stand, but a man's life, a man's business. Sometimes it ain't the sand that's the problem. Sometimes it's the fellas you're building it with who'll dig out the foundation from right under your feet. And a man, when his world starts to crumble like old concrete, he learns real quick who's willing to get their hands dirty shoring it up, and who's just looking for an easier exit. Most folks find out the hard way that loyalty ain't just a word you throw around. It's a heavy-duty bolt, tested under pressure, and sometimes you gotta lose a few to find the real ones that hold true. Vince knew that truth down to his bones. 45 years old, and every one of them felt etched into the calluses on his hands and the quiet lines around his eyes. He wasn't the kind of man you'd notice much in a crowd, not unless you were looking for the silent strength of someone who understood what it meant to really build something. He was a mechanic, not the kind who just slapped parts on, but the kind who listened to an engine cough and wheeze and knew, without a fancy diagnostic tool, exactly where the heartache was. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred, told a story all their own, a history of grease, rust, and the satisfying clunk of a wrench tightening just right. They were hands that had coaxed life back into countless dead machines, rebuilt more broken dreams under hoods than most folks dared to admit they had. He carried himself with the quiet weight of experience, not bitterness, but a deep-seated knowing that life didn't hand out free passes. His eyes, a steely blue, usually scanned the world with a patient, almost weary observation. He saw things, not just what was on the surface, but the wear and tear underneath, the hidden cracks that most folks overlooked. Small talk was a foreign language to Vince, unless it involved cubic inches, torque specs, or the baffling intricacies of a teenager's homework. He could come across as gruff, sure, but a gruffness born of fairness and a silent expectation that folks would do what they said they'd do. It was a simple code, forged in the grit of a garage, and it was a code he lived by. He had a pride in his craftsmanship, a deep respect for honest work, and a quiet, unyielding ambition that hummed just beneath the surface, much like a finely tuned engine waiting for the open road. He was Vince, a man who understood the language of metal and oil better than most understood their own hearts, and he was about to learn a whole new dialect, the language of betrayal. There's an old saying out on the shop floor, the kind whispered over lukewarm coffee when the day's first wrench hits metal, that a man's true character ain't forged in the easy miles, but when the engine seizes and the whole damn rig is dead on the side of the road. That's when you see what he's made of, if he'll get his hands dirty, if he'll stick with the problem or just walk away. And sometimes, it's when the road seems smoothest that the real cracks form. Vince, he knew a thing or two about smooth roads and a whole lot more about cracks. He understood the hidden wear, the unseen fatigue that could bring down the strongest machine or the most trusted partnership. He debuilt his life, his business, on the belief that a solid foundation, honest effort, and a handshake worth more than any contract would see you through. He thought he knew the world. He thought he had things figured out. Vince's world started not with a bang, but with a groan from the old bedside clock radio at 5 in the morning, every single weekday, before the first bird even thought about chirping, before the first newspaper hit the driveways. Sarah, his wife, would still be deep asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He'd swing his feet to the cold floor, the worn linoleum a familiar shock, and pull on the same faded work jeans, the same grease-stained t-shirt. Downstairs, he'd pour himself a coffee so strong it could strip paint, eat a piece of toast standing over the sink, and then grab his lunch pail, packed the night before by Sarah, a practical woman, knew how to stretch $1 and a meal. The drive to the shop was always quiet, the street still dark and empty save for a few other early risers, bakers, truckers, sanitation workers. He liked those moments, the world still hushed, giving him a chance to clear his head, or at least try to. He'd pull up to the shop, unlock the big roll-up doors, and the smell of oil, gasoline, and old tires would hit him, familiar as his own breath. He'd flick on the lights, wake up the coffee machine, and then get to it. Another day, another engine to coax back to life, another transmission to crack open, another worn brake pad to replace. It was honest work, sure. Good, solid, honest work. And Vince was damn good at it. He could listen to an engine's cough and tell you what it had for breakfast. He could spot a loose bolt from across the bay. But the truth was, for all the satisfaction of a job well done, there was a monotony that had begun to seep into his bones, heavy as old engine oil. The same problems, different cars. The same grim determination to earn enough to keep the lights on, the kids clothed, food on the table. Lily, his 16-year-old, was already talking about colleges and tuition fees that made his stomach clench. Ben, 12, was growing like a weed and burning through sneakers faster than Vince could patch a tire. There were always bills, always something breaking at the house, always another month to make ends meet. Their business was supposed to ease that burden, to build something more than just survival. It was supposed to be a foundation, not a treadmill. Sometimes, late at night, after Sarah and the kids were asleep, Vince would find himself out in his own garage at home. Not working, not tinkering. Just standing there, running a hand over the cool steel of a wrench on his workbench, the organized chaos of his tools a comfort. And that's when the other stuff would creep in, the things he usually kept buried under layers of practical work and daily responsibilities. The questions he didn't like to ask himself. He'd always dreamed bigger than just fixing cars. He'd dreamt of innovation, of building something truly special, maybe even designing custom engines, pushing the boundaries of what a vehicle could do. He had ideas, always had. Blueprints in his head for modifications, for performance upgrades that could turn a simple sedan into a beast. He'd shared those dreams once with his partners when they first started. They nodded, smiled, talked about growth, expansion, building an empire, not just a repair shop. But somewhere along the line, the talk had died down, replaced by the relentless grind of everyday repairs, the pursuit of the next quick buck. He'd bought into it, the idea that they needed to solidify the base first, pay their dues before they could reach for the stars. He trusted them, believed their pragmatic approach was just a temporary detour on the road to their shared vision. But years had turned into a decade, and the dream of building something extraordinary, something that showcased his true skill and passion, had quietly atrophied. It was still there, a phantom ache in his chest, a low hum beneath the surface, like a misfiring cylinder he couldn't quite diagnose. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong, capable of such precision, and sometimes he'd feel a pang, a regret for the things they hadn't built, the dreams they hadn't chased. He was a mechanic, yes, a good one, but he felt like he was meant to be more, to do more. And the gap between that feeling and his daily reality sometimes felt like a canyon he'd never cross, a chasm of unfulfilled ambition. He was tired, not just physically, but deep down in his soul, tired of putting one foot in front of the other without truly moving forward. He was living the life, but not his life, not the one he'd pictured when he first gripped a wrench with purpose. And that was a heavy weight to carry, heavier than any engine block. The ache had been a dull throb, easily ignored amidst the clang of wrenches and the smell of oil. But that particular Tuesday, it sharpened into a sudden, searing pain. Vince had been at his bench, meticulously cleaning a carburetor, a task he usually found meditative. John, one of his partners, had been on the phone, voice lowered, almost a whisper near the office door. Vince hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but a phrase snagged his attention, like a loose thread on a spinning wheel. Can't risk Vince finding out before the paperwork's done. Vince froze. His hands, usually so steady, faltered. The carburetor slipped, clattering against the bench. John's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Vince's for a fraction of a second, a fleeting flicker of alarm before he forced a strained smile. "Just a client, buddy, tough negotiator," he'd said, too quickly, too brightly. Vince had nodded, a cold dread beginning to seep into his bones, but he didn't push it. He just felt it, the invisible hand squeezing his gut. He started paying closer attention. Little things, emails left open on office computers when he'd pop in, client files that seemed to be missing, cash receipts that didn't quite line up with the service invoices. It was like a game of cat and mouse, only he was the mouse unknowingly trapped. He'd spend late nights after Sarah and the kids were asleep, hunched over the ledgers, the numbers blurring, trying to make sense of the growing discrepancies. He felt like he was losing his mind, second-guessing his own memory, his own eyes. Was he just tired, overwhelmed, or was something truly rotten? Then came the punch to the gut. It was a Thursday late afternoon. He'd gone to pick up a special order part from a supplier across town, one they'd used for years, a good, honest man named Frank. Frank, seeing Vince, clapped him on the shoulder. "Heard you boys are setting up that new satellite shop," Frank said, a genuine smile on his face. "Good for you, expanding like that." John and Mike came by last week, talking about opening in the old auto body down by the highway. Said you were handling the original shop while they branched out. The words hit Vince with the force of a hydraulic press. New satellite shop, John and Mike, without him, handling the original shop. It wasn't branching out, it was cutting him off at the roots. His blood ran cold. He tried to play it cool, a grimace masquerading as a smile. Yeah, Frank, we're looking into some options. But the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He finished his transaction, his hands trembling slightly as he signed the slip, his mind racing, piecing together every hushed phone call, every missing file, every discrepancy in the books. They weren't just siphoning funds. They were building an escape raft, and he wasn't invited. He was the anchor they planned to cut loose. The betrayal wasn't just a business failing. It was a personal amputation, a severing of trust he'd believed was as solid as welded steel. The drive back was a blur, the familiar streets foreign, his mind a whirlwind of hurt and rage. The dream wasn't just atrophied. It was being actively dismantled, brick by the very hands he'd trusted to build it with him. That night, the silence of his modest suburban house felt heavier than any engine block he'd ever lifted. Sarah and the kids were asleep, their gentle breathing a stark contrast to the hurricane raging inside him. He sat in the worn armchair in his living room, the muted glow of the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room, mimicking the shadows in his soul. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, the hour where truth stripped away all the comfortable illusions. He hadn't told Sarah yet, couldn't, not until he knew what he was going to say, what he was going to do. The thought of looking into her worried eyes, seeing the fear for their future reflected there, twisted a knife in his gut. His hands, usually his pride, the tools of his trade, felt useless, clenched into fists, then splayed open, then clenched again. He stared at them, seeing not the precision and strength, but the years of sweat, the grease embedded deep in the lines, the calluses earned in shared purpose, now feeling like badges of his own naivety. "What have I done?" he whispered into the dark, his voice hoarse, alien. He poured everything into that shop. Every waking hour, every spare dime, every ounce of his skill. He'd trusted John and Mike like brothers, shared meals, laughed over beers, talked about their kids' futures, built a life on a foundation he thought was unshakable. And they had systematically, coldly been planning to pull the rug out from under him. He felt like a fool, a blind idiot, so caught up in the work, in the belief in his friends, that he hadn't seen the snakes wriggling beneath his feet. The anger was a hot, searing flame, but beneath it, a colder, deeper current of despair. What now? He was 45. Too old, he told himself, for this kind of setback. Too old to start over. The years felt like heavy chains, dragging him down. He'd lost his ambition somewhere along the way, let it wither in the service of a shared dream that was never truly shared. The dreams of building something truly special, something that reflected his craftsmanship, his integrity, felt like distant echoes, mocking him from across that canyon of unfulfilled ambition. He was tired, bone-deep tired, but sleep was a mocking luxury tonight. Every breath was a conscious effort, every beat of his heart a reminder of the raw, exposed nerve that was his shattered trust. His life, the life he'd built, felt like it had dissolved into a puddle of oil and broken parts, leaving him stranded, alone in the dead of night, questioning every choice, every belief, every moment he'd ever invested. It wasn't just a business that was gone. It was a piece of his soul, ripped away, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. The ache had been a dull throb, easily ignored amidst the clang of wrenches and the smell of oil. But that particular Tuesday, it sharpened into a sudden, searing pain. Vince had been at his bench, meticulously cleaning a carburetor, a task he usually found meditative. John, one of his partners, had been on the phone, voice lowered, almost a whisper, near the office door. Vince hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but a phrase snagged his attention like a loose thread on a spinning wheel. "Can't risk Vince finding out before the paperwork's done." Vince froze. His hands, usually so steady, faltered. The carburetor slipped, clattering against the bench. John's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Vince's for a fraction of a second, a fleeting flicker of alarm before he forced a strained smile. "Just a client, buddy, tough negotiator," he'd said too quickly, too brightly. Vince had nodded, a cold dread beginning to seep into his bones, but he didn't push it. He just felt it, the invisible hand squeezing his gut. He started paying closer attention. Little things, emails left open on office computers when he'd pop in. Client files that seemed to be missing. Cash receipts that didn't quite line up with the service invoices. It was like a game of cat and mouse, only he was the mouse, unknowingly trapped. He'd spend late nights after Sarah and the kids were asleep, hunched over the ledgers, the numbers blurring, trying to make sense of the growing discrepancies. He felt like he was losing his mind, second-guessing his own memory, his own eyes. Was he just tired, overwhelmed, or was something truly rotten? Then came the punch to the gut. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. He'd gone to pick up a special order part from a supplier across town, one they'd used for years, a good, honest man named Frank. Frank, seeing Vince, clapped him on the shoulder. Heard you boys are setting up that new satellite shop, Frank said, a genuine smile on his face. Good for you expanding like that. John and Mike came by last week, talking about opening in the old auto body down by the highway. Said you were handling the original shop while they branched out. The words hit Vince with the force of a hydraulic press. New satellite shop, John and Mike, without him, handling the original shop. It wasn't branching out, it was cutting him off at the roots. His blood ran cold. He tried to play it cool, a grimace masquerading as a smile. Yeah, Frank, we're looking into some options. But the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He finished his transaction, his hands trembling slightly as he signed the slip, his mind racing, piecing together every hushed phone call, every missing file, every discrepancy in the books. They weren't just siphoning funds. They were building an escape raft, and he wasn't invited. He was the anchor they planned to cut loose. The betrayal wasn't just a business failing. It was a personal amputation, a severing of trust he'd believed was as solid as welded steel. The drive back was a blur, the familiar streets foreign, his mind a whirlwind of hurt and rage. The dream wasn't just atrophied. It was being actively dismantled, brick, by the very hands he'd trusted to build it with him. That night, the silence of his modest suburban house felt heavier than any engine block he'd ever lifted. Sarah and the kids were asleep, their gentle breathing a stark contrast to the hurricane raging inside him. He sat in the worn armchair in his living room, the muted glow of the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room, mimicking the shadows in his soul. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, the hour where truth stripped away all the comfortable illusions. He hadn't told Sarah yet. Couldn't, not until he knew what he was going to say, what he was going to do. The thought of looking into her worried eyes, seeing the fear for their future reflected there, twisted a knife in his gut. His hands, usually his pride, the tools of his trade, felt useless, clenched into fists, then splayed open, then clenched again. He stared at them, seeing not the precision and strength, but the years of sweat, the grease embedded deep in the lines, the calluses earned in shared purpose, now feeling like badges of his own naivety. "What have I done?" he whispered into the dark, his voice hoarse, alien. He poured everything into that shop. Every waking hour, every spare dime, every ounce of his skill. He'd trusted John and Mike like brothers, shared meals, laughed over beers, talked about their kids' futures, built a life on a foundation he thought was unshakable. And they had systematically, coldly been planning to pull the rug out from under him. He felt like a fool, a blind idiot, so caught up in the work, in the belief in his friends, that he hadn't seen the snakes wriggling beneath his feet. The anger was a hot, searing flame, but beneath it, a colder, deeper current of despair. What now? He was 45. Too old, he told himself, for this kind of setback. Too old to start over. The years felt like heavy chains, dragging him down. He'd lost his ambition somewhere along the way, let it wither in the service of a shared dream that was never truly shared. The dreams of building something truly special, something that reflected his craftsmanship, his integrity, felt like distant echoes, mocking him from across that canyon of unfulfilled ambition. He was tired, bone-deep tired, but sleep was a mocking luxury tonight. Every breath was a conscious effort, every beat of his heart a reminder of the raw, exposed nerve that was his shattered trust. His life, the life he'd built, felt like it had dissolved into a puddle of oil and broken parts, leaving him stranded, alone in the dead of night, questioning every choice, every belief, every moment he'd ever invested. It wasn't just a business that was gone. It was a piece of his soul ripped away, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. He didn't know how he would ever patch himself back together. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and spitting rain, when the first real crack appeared. Not a grand, theatrical discovery, but a slow, insidious seep that started with Mrs. Henderson. She'd been bringing her ancient Buick to them for 20 years, a sweet old woman with a smile as comforting as a warm blanket. Vince had just finished rotating her tires, wiping grease from his hands with a rag as she paid up front. "You know, Vince," she'd said, tucking the receipt into her purse, "your partners always give me a discount on the oil changes." Said it was for being such a loyal customer. Nice fellas. She gave a little chuckle. "Guess they forgot this time, eh?" Vince felt a small, cold drop of something he couldn't quite name land in his gut. He always handled the repairs, the hands-on stuff. His partners, Mike and Gary, managed the books, the client relations, the business side. He trusted them implicitly. "A discount, Mrs. Henderson?" he'd asked, his voice neutral, but his ears suddenly sharper. "No problem at all, let me just check that for you." He'd gone to the office terminal, pretending to pull up her history. There was no record of any such discount. Not just today, but for the last 3 years she mentioned. He just nodded, given her a genuine smile, and quickly adjusted her bill, blaming a system glitch. He felt a flicker of unease, a tiny crack in the bedrock of his trust, but he pushed it down. Mike and Gary were good guys, friends. Probably just an oversight, a kindness they did off the books for an old lady. But the seed was planted. That night, after Sarah and the kids were asleep, the house quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator, Vince found himself in the cramped office above the shop. The numbers had always been their domain. He trusted them with it, focusing on turning wrenches. But Mrs. Henderson's words replayed in his head, a discordant note in the symphony of their shared business. He opened the accounting software, logged in with the shared password they all used, and started digging. At first, it was just minor discrepancies, things that could be explained away. A misplaced invoice here, a slightly off inventory count there. His brow furrowed deeper with each click. Then he found it, a separate file buried deep within the network, password protected. He tried their wives, birthdays, their old high school locker numbers, every shared memory he could think of. Nothing. Then, almost as an afterthought, he typed in their shop's original address, the tiny two-bay garage where they'd first started, full of dreams and cheap coffee. It clicked open. His breath hitched. It was a mirror image of their main accounts, but stripped down, sanitized. And there, stark and undeniable, were the shadow transactions. Funds siphoned off, client payments diverted, padded expenses, inflated material costs. A cold, surgical precision to it. A separate company listed as a supplier that was nothing more than a shell. Money flowing out, never coming back. It wasn't just a few bucks here and there for Mrs. Henderson's discount. It was a methodical, calculated bleed. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. His partners, his friends, were slowly, systematically gutting their own business. His business. And the timeline made it clear. It had started subtly a few years back, growing bolder, accelerating in recent months. The final, crushing blow came with the emails. Between Mike and Gary, discussions of Vince's exit strategy, plans to buy him out for a fraction of his actual share after they'd bled the business dry and funneled the real profits elsewhere, plans to leave him with the husk. He'll never see it coming, one email read. Too busy playing in the grease. The world seemed to tilt. The chair groaned beneath him, the fluorescent light above flickered, but Vince barely registered it. His vision narrowed, the words on the screen blurring into a sickening green and black. He wasn't playing in the grease. He was building their empire brick by bloody brick while they were chiseling away at the foundation, planning to bury him in the rubble. He felt a profound physical nausea, not just from anger, but from the sheer, unadulterated betrayal. It wasn't just money. It was a trust, a friendship, a shared vision he'd poured his entire adult life into. They hadn't just stolen from him. They'd stolen his past, twisted his memories, made a mockery of every honest day's work he'd ever put in. He didn't remember standing up, but suddenly he was pacing the narrow office, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The screensaver kicked in, displaying the shop's logo, the very symbol of his broken dream. He stared at it, a quiet roar building in his chest. Then he just walked. Out of the office, down the metal stairs, past the silent bays filled with cars waiting for his honest touch. He kept walking, out into the spitting rain, until he was home. Back in his modest kitchen, the silence of the 3 a.m. hour was deafening, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet that Vince had meant to fix for weeks. He sat at the oak table, the worn wood cold beneath his palms. The laptop was open, the incriminating files glowing dimly, casting a sickly pallor on his face. Sleep was a foreign country, unreachable. Every muscle in his body felt like a clenched fist. He thought of Sarah, sleeping soundly down the hall, oblivious. Of Lily and Ben, dreaming their kids' dreams, safe in their beds. His chest tightened with a fear so sharp it felt like a knife blade twisting. He hadn't just been foolish, he'd been negligent. He'd entrusted his family's future to 2 snakes in suits, men who had eaten at his table, laughed at his jokes, offered condolences at his father's funeral. He'd detold them his fears, his hopes, his quiet ambitions. And they had taken it all, cataloged it, and used it to fuel their betrayal. He ran a calloused hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the weary lines around his eyes. 45? What was left? He'd sunk every last penny, every ounce of sweat, every dream into that shop. He'd given up weekends, holidays, even missed a few school plays because of a critical job for one of their big clients that, he now realized, were probably being siphoned off even as he worked. He'd sacrificed time with his family, believing he was building something secure for them. And it had all been a house of cards built on a swamp of deceit. The anger was still there, a simmering pot of oil, but it was overshadowed by a crushing wave of shame. How could he have been so blind? So stupid? His deep-seated pride in his craftsmanship, his integrity, felt like it had been stomped into the dirt. He, Vince, the man who prided himself on seeing the hidden flaw in an engine, the loose bolt others missed, had been utterly, completely blind to the rot at the heart of his own life. The weight of experience, which he'd worn like a badge of honor, now felt like a heavy cloak of foolishness. He saw himself, for the first time, not as the reliable, gruff-but-fair owner, but as a trusting fool, easily manipulated, a mark. He looked around the modest kitchen, at the worn linoleum, the slightly chipped mugs in the cupboard. This was all they had, all he had built for them. And it was all on the brink of collapse because of his misplaced trust. He saw the faded photos on the fridge, Lily's first communion, Ben's soccer trophy, Sarah's radiant smile on their anniversary. He wanted more for them, so much more than this precarious existence built on someone else's lies. He was tired, yes, bone-deep tired, but it wasn't a physical exhaustion. It was a soul weariness, a profound disillusionment that settled deep in his bones. He didn't know how he would face the morning, how he would tell Sarah, how he would pick up the pieces of a life that felt utterly, brutally broken. The early morning light, thin and unforgiving, painted the kitchen in shades of gray. Vince sat at the table, a cold cup of coffee long forgotten in his hand, the bitterness a poor match for the taste in his mouth. He was tired of the anger, tired of the shame. Mostly, he was just tired. Tired of the weight, the pretense, the constant feeling of being undermined by the very people he had trusted. He looked at the chipped mug, a gift from Lily years ago with a faded drawing of a wonky car. His car, she'd said. And it hit him. It wasn't just the betrayal, the money, the clients. It was the chipping away at him, at his pride, at his belief in what they were building. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep showing up day after day to a place tainted by their greed, pretending that the cracks weren't there, growing wider with every lie. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. He thought of his tools, the good ones, the ones his old man had passed down, the ones he kept sharp and clean. They deserved better than to be used in a business built on such a flimsy foundation. A quiet, "Enough!" escaped him, barely a whisper in the silent house. It wasn't a roar of defiance, not a grand declaration. It was the kind of enough that comes after a long, hard fight when the fighter is too exhausted to land another punch, but still has just enough strength left to stand up and walk away from the ring. He didn't know what enough looked like yet, what shape it would take. He didn't have a plan, a new path, or even a glimmer of a solution. All he knew was that this slow, agonizing erosion of everything he held dear simply could not continue. He couldn't go back to that shop, not with them, not in this state. The thought was a cold, hard stone in his gut, but it was also, strangely, a relief. A profound, unsettling peace settled over him, the kind that only comes when you finally admit the truth, no matter how ugly. The next morning, the sun rose just as it always did, indifferent to the shifting landscape of Vince's life. The alarm blared at 5 a.m., a familiar screech that usually signaled the start of another day of quiet resentment. This time it felt different. Not better, not yet, but different. He lay there for a moment, the weight of the previous night's decision pressing down on him. His gut churned with fear, a cold, cloying dread. What was he doing? Walking away from everything, from the only place he'd known for years, the place he'd poured his soul into. The comfortable inertia of habit pulled at him, begging him to roll over, to pretend yesterday hadn't happened, to just go in and try to fix a transmission and forget the betrayal. But then he saw the faded photo on his bedside table, Sarah, beaming, Lily with a gap-toothed smile, Ben clinging to his leg, all looking up at him as if he had all the answers. They deserved a foundation, not a swamp. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath his feet. The house was still quiet, everyone else asleep. He moved through his routine mechanically, shower, shave, coffee, but with a new, grim determination etched on his face. Instead of turning towards the main shop, the one that bore the name they'd built together, Vince steered his old Ford pickup towards the smaller, dustier back lot. It was an abandoned service bay, a forgotten corner of the property he'd always leased as overflow storage. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grime-caked windows. This was it, day one. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of old oil and neglect. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on loose debris. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows. It was a hell of a long way from the bustling, well-lit bays of their main operation. He thought about the calls he'd have to make, the clients he'd have to talk to, the vendors who'd demand payment. The betrayal still stung, a phantom ache beneath his ribs, but now a flicker of something else sparked. Anger, yes, but also defiance. He didn't know how to start exactly. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic unveiling, just the quiet, methodical work he knew. He picked up a broom from where it leaned against a wall, its bristles worn to nubs. The first sweep of dust was a physical act, a declaration in itself. He wasn't just cleaning a garage. He was sweeping away the rot, making space for something new, something honest. He spent the first hour simply sweeping, then another pulling down cobwebs. His muscles, accustomed to the precise movements of wrenching, felt the strain of the unfamiliar, repetitive labor. He found an old, rusty toolbox, heavy with disuse. He wiped it down with a rag, revealing the faded blue paint beneath. It wasn't about the tools, not yet. It was about the act of tending, of cleaning, of starting fresh. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for Jimmy, a young mechanic who had worked under him for years, a kid with grease under his fingernails and a good head on his shoulders. Jimmy had always seemed to watch Vince, to learn from him, to share that same bedrock pride in a job done right. He was the first name that came to mind, the first flicker of who might actually stand by him when the chips were down. A deep breath. He hit call. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about seeing who was truly loyal. The phone rang twice before Jimmy's familiar, slightly raspy voice answered. Yo, Vince. Everything all right? You don't usually call this late. Vince cleared his throat, the words feeling a little rough in his mouth. Jimmy, yeah, everything's complicated. Look, you busy tomorrow? I got something I want to talk to you about. Face to face, my place before dawn. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a rustle. Before dawn? All right, Vince. You know I'm always game for an early start. I'll be there. What's up? I'll tell you when you get here, Vince said, keeping his voice even. Just be ready to work. He hung up, a knot of apprehension and anticipation tightening in his gut. He had put it out there. Now he had to see if anyone would answer the call. He stayed in the dimly lit shop for another hour, not doing much, just standing amidst the ghosts of what was and the shadows of what might be. He ran a hand over a cold engine block, the metal familiar beneath his touch. This was his language, his solace. The next morning, Jimmy's beat-up pickup rumbled into Vince's driveway a few minutes before 5 a.m. The young mechanic, barely 30, looked a bit bewildered but squared his shoulders. His eyes, though tired, held a spark of that same quiet dedication Vince had always seen. Morning, Vince. What's the emergency? Jimmy asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Vince didn't waste words. He led Jimmy into the main bay, flicked on the fluorescent lights, bathing the disarray in a harsh glare. He laid it all out, the betrayal, the siphoning, the plan to cut him out. He watched Jimmy's face fall, then harden with a quiet anger that mirrored his own. They did that to you, Vince? After all you built? Jimmy's voice was low, incredulous. Yeah, and now, Vince gestured around the empty bays, the scattered tools, the dust-coated lift. It's just me, and I'm starting again. From scratch, I can't pay you what they paid you, not yet. Hell, I can barely pay myself. But I promise you this, Jimmy, whatever we build here, it'll be honest. It'll be ours, and we'll do it right. You in? Jimmy didn't hesitate. Vince, you taught me everything I know. Those two, they just barked orders. You always had my back. I'm in. What do we do first? That day, they cleaned, they sorted, they hauled trash. They scraped grease from floors, wiped down benches, and meticulously organized tool chests. It was grueling, back-breaking labor that had nothing to do with engines and everything to do with laying a foundation. By midday, Vince's shoulders ached, and his hands were raw, but he felt a different kind of exhaustion, the good kind earned by honest effort. Jimmy, a man half his age, kept pace without complaint, his dedication a silent affirmation. But the physical grind was only one battle. The next morning, the financial reality hit with the force of a wrench dropped on concrete. He had enough savings to cover personal bills for a few months, maybe. But advertising, parts inventory, even just utilities for the massive garage, it was a bottomless pit. He stared at the stack of bills, old and new, and the numbers swam before his eyes. He considered closing up shop, taking a job at another garage, letting the whole dream die. Sarah, seeing the dark cloud on his brow, just put a hand on his arm. It's 1 foot in front of the other, Vince. Just 1 foot. Day 3 brought a slow, steady rain that seemed to mirror the gray in his soul. They had done all the obvious cleaning. Now what? The phone wasn't ringing. No customers were pulling up. Doubt, a venomous snake, began to coil in his gut. He was doing all this, rebuilding from nothing for what? Was he just a stubborn fool clinging to a dream that was already dead? He almost called Sarah, almost told her he was done. But then he looked at Jimmy, patiently sanding down an old workbench, humming a tune under his breath. He saw the trust in Jimmy's eyes, the quiet belief. He couldn't quit on him, not yet. He couldn't quit on himself. Days bled into a week. They spent hours cold-calling old clients, many of whom were hesitant, unsure what had happened with the old business. Vince's old partners had been effective at sowing doubt, spinning tales that painted him as the difficult one, the one who couldn't be trusted. It felt like walking through quicksand, every step an immense effort yielding little progress. He'd hang up the phone, the silence on the other end a deafening echo of his failure. There were days he'd just stare at the empty bays, a heavy weariness settling over him, the physical aches from working feeling secondary to the ache in his spirit. He even caught himself looking at job postings online, the thought of a regular paycheck, a predictable routine, a seductive whisper in his ear. One afternoon, a clunky old sedan, a relic from the late 90s, sputtered into the lot. The engine coughed and died with a final wheeze. A young woman, clearly stressed, got out. "My car." It just stopped. Do you fix stuff like this?" It was a test, a small one, but a test nonetheless. Vince looked at the car, then at Jimmy, who had already grabbed his toolbox. This wasn't about the money, not really. It was about proving they could still do the work, that their hands hadn't forgotten, that their integrity was intact. It was about starting to earn trust, one struggling engine at a time. They tackled that old sedan with a fierce focus, diagnosing the problem methodically, explaining each step to the nervous owner. When they finally got it purring again, the young woman's relief was palpable. She paid them what she could, a little less than their usual rate, but Vince didn't care. She drove away with a genuine smile, and that, for the first time in weeks, felt like a victory. But the next few days were quiet again. The phone remained silent. The only cars in the lot were their own. The brief flush of success faded under the relentless pressure of bills and an empty schedule. Vince found himself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. again, the familiar demons of doubt circling. He thought of his kids, of Sarah, of the life he had promised them. Was he dragging them down with his stubborn pride? Was it time to admit defeat, to pack it all in and find a steady job, any steady job, even if it meant sacrificing his dream? The temptation was a heavy cloak, threatening to smother the last ember of his resolve. He felt the weight of it, the quiet desperation. But deep down, beneath the weariness and the self-doubt, a stubborn refusal hardened. No, not yet. He had faced down bigger engines, bigger problems. He wasn't going to let this one beat him. Not after everything he'd already lost. Not after Jimmy had shown up. Vince rose with the alarm that morning, the 5 a.m. chime feeling less like a slap and more like a challenge he was ready to meet. The quiet desperation from the 3 a.m. hour hadn't vanished, but it had morphed into a stubborn, white-hot resolve. He knew waiting wouldn't cut it. Waiting was what the old Vince did, trusting the established flow, expecting things to simply work because they always had. This new Vince, still forming like metal under a blacksmith's hammer, knew he had to forge his own. He was done being passive. He spent the first hour not on engines, but on paper. He wasn't just paying bills. He was meticulously reevaluating every line item, every supplier, scrutinizing contracts that had once been glanced over. He called a few long-standing clients, not to beg for work, but to simply check in, to offer genuine advice on minor car issues, reminding them he was still there, still reliable, but now with a clarity he hadn't possessed before. He was choosing his battles, choosing his allies, even among his clientele. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind of detailed process he used when rebuilding a transmission from scratch, laying out every gear and bearing, cleaning each one, checking for imperfections. He was rebuilding his business the same way, piece by careful piece, with an unwavering focus on integrity and quality. Days bled into weeks. The calls for check-ins, the quiet word of mouth, slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to bear fruit. A local bakery owner, old Mrs. Henderson, whose delivery van he'd serviced for years, brought her personal car in for a major service. "Heard you're back to just doing honest work, Vince," she said, her eyes crinkling into a warm smile. "Good, we need more of that, especially with all the, well, you know." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew about the split. It wasn't a flood of business, just a steady trickle, but it was a trickle of the right kind of work, from people who trusted him, not the tarnished name of the old partnership. Each new customer felt like a tiny victory, a brick laid in a new, stronger foundation. Jimmy, who had become a fixture by Vince's side, noticed it first, not in the number of cars, but in the man himself. Vince's shoulders, once hunched with the invisible weight of betrayal and worry, seemed to straighten a little more each day. The deep lines around his eyes, while still present, held less weariness and more focused intensity. He wasn't as quick to sigh, and when he spoke, it was with a quiet, unshakable certainty that hadn't been there before, even in the good times. There was a new gravitas to him, a steeliness born of fire. "You're different, Vince," Jimmy said one afternoon, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. They were patching a tire, the kind of small, overlooked job the old business would have scoffed at. Vince met his gaze, a rare moment of direct eye contact from the usually reserved man. "Just seeing things clearer, I guess," Vince grunted, tightening a lug nut, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Jimmy just nodded, but his grin was a mile wide. "Yeah, clearer. Good." He understood. The good was infectious, a quiet hum of renewed purpose in the shop. Vince started approaching every repair, every client interaction with a palpable sense of renewed purpose and pride. He talked less about the shop's painful past and more about its hard-earned future, about the unwavering quality of the work, about the integrity of his hands and Jimmy's. He found a strange, almost spiritual clarity in the sheer, honest hard work, the satisfying ache of muscles at the end of a long day, the clean smell of oil and metal. The silence in the shop, once heavy with unspoken failure, was now filled with the purposeful clank of wrenches, the hum of diagnostic tools, the occasional burst of laughter from Jimmy, or a shared, knowing glance between them. It was a smaller space, but it felt bigger, cleaner, more real. At home, Sarah saw it too, a transformation that went beyond the physical. He wasn't bringing the toxic worry home in the same way. He was still tired, profoundly so, but the exhaustion was cleaner without the toxic residue of resentment or the gnawing uncertainty. He'd talk about the day's wins, however small, a particularly tricky electrical short diagnosed, a grateful customer, a new part sourced efficiently over dinner. He'd spend extra time with Ben, patiently explaining the basics of engine function, nurturing the boy's budding curiosity with a hands-on approach. He'd help Lily with her math, his practical mind finding elegant solutions she hadn't considered, his focus sharper than ever. One evening, after the kids were asleep and the house had settled into a comfortable quiet, Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of herbal tea cradled in her hands. "You know," she began softly, her gaze steady on his, "I was really worried for a while there, more than I let on." Vince looked up from his meticulously organized stack of invoices, his expression softening. "I know, me too, every night at 3 a.m. He admitted it, a rare glimpse into the raw fear he'd suppressed. "But you're coming back," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet admiration. "Stronger somehow, like you shed all the dead weight." She reached across the worn wooden table and covered his calloused hand with her own, a gesture of unwavering support. "You're building something new, aren't you?" Vince met her gaze, a small, unburdening smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, Sarah, I am." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise. "And this time it's going to be solid, built right." The quiet affirmation sealed something between them, a renewed understanding. Back at the shop, the change wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like a persistent, steady hum. Vince moved with a different kind of authority now. The old frantic energy, the constant looking over his shoulder, it was gone, replaced by a methodical calm. He spent more time on the floor, not just barking orders, but shoulder to shoulder with Mike, troubleshooting, teaching, sharing the quiet satisfaction of a job done perfectly. Mike noticed it first. He'd seen Vince at his most stressed, most defeated. Now there was a light in the older man's eyes that hadn't been there in years. It wasn't a naive optimism, but a hard-won clarity. Vince started making small, deliberate changes. He invested in a new diagnostic tool, not the cheapest one, but the best, saying, "We're not cutting corners for nobody." He streamlined inventory, cutting out the junk parts his former partners had favored, replacing them with quality, reliable components. He revamped the customer waiting area, just a fresh coat of paint, a decent coffee machine, but it signaled a shift in respect. Word started to spread. Not about a big, flashy new business, but about a place where the work was honest, where Vince himself stood behind every repair. Old customers who had drifted away because of the previous partner's shoddy practices started trickling back. They'd come in a little wary, but after seeing Vince's focused intensity, after getting a straight answer and a fair price, they'd leave with a handshake and a renewed trust. Weeks turned into a couple of months. The shop, though smaller in scale than the bloated operation it once was, felt alive. It had a heartbeat. Vince had found a young guy, fresh out of trade school, eager to learn, and brought him on. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a protege, someone he could teach the right way, someone who understood that craftsmanship wasn't just about fixing, but about integrity. He saw a bit of his younger self in the kid, but also a chance to instill the lessons he'd learned the hard way. His empire wasn't grand in the way he'd once envisioned, not sprawling with multiple locations or a huge payroll. It was a single, sturdy workshop, clean and efficient, humming with the sound of engines being coaxed back to life, filled with the quiet camaraderie of men who respected each other and the work they did. It was built on the bedrock of honesty and skill, brick by painful brick. Vince, standing amidst the organized chaos of his garage, his hands stained with grease but his spirit clear, understood now that true wealth wasn't in the numbers in a bank account, but in the trust earned, the quality delivered, and the peace of mind that came from building something real. He was still Vince, the quiet mechanic, hands perpetually dirty, mind always turning over the next problem. But the weight he carried now wasn't the burden of betrayal, it was the proud heft of responsibility, a load he carried willingly. He was sharper, more discerning. He knew the true value of a loyal hand, a genuine smile, a straight answer. The old hurt was still there, a scar tissue under his ribs, a permanent reminder. But it no longer defined him. It had refined him. One quiet afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag, watching Mike expertly torque a lug nut, Vince leaned against a toolbox. He thought about the men who'd walked away, or rather, who he'd walked away from. You know, he mused aloud, not really to Mike, but to the hum of the air compressor, you learn real quick who's with you when the wheels fall off. And you learn even quicker that it's better to build something solid with good people, even if it's smaller than something shaky with snakes. He paused, looking at his clean, honest shop. Trust ain't given, son. It's earned. And sometimes you gotta lose a few to find the real ones. He picked up a wrench, its cool steel familiar in his grip. The sun, slanting through the big bay door, caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the grit and the glory of an honest day's work. Some things, he knew, you just had to build yourself from the ground up, with nothing but your two hands and a clearer vision. And sometimes, losing everything